But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where the past comes alive. Today, we embark on a journey back to the Age of Discovery, a time of bold explorers and world-changing encounters. In this episode, we delve into the saga of Hernán Cortés, a figure whose ambition and actions shaped the course of history. From the bustling streets of Spain to the majestic Aztec Empire, we explore how Cortés' conquest for glory led to the fall of a civilization and the forging of a new world. Join us as we unravel the complexities of this pivotal moment in history, where cultures clashed, empires fell, and the modern world began to take shape. This is the History in Motion podcast, and today we witness the rise and fall of empires through the eyes of Hernán Cortés.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we'll be continuing our story from last week about the Spanish conquest of Mexico and Central America, where last week we talked about Montezuma II and the fall of the Aztec Empire. But there was a man who led the conquistadors to victory and really is seen as a very controversial figure in Central America and specifically Mexico nowadays. And that's Hernán Cortés, who is the conquistador leader, not really a military leader, just kind of a leader of a bunch of dudes who kind of rolled into Mexico and did some pretty nasty things. So I think, Richie, we prefaced this last week, and this story is just absolutely fascinating from just so many different levels on how this is almost like an alien invasion to the Aztecs, where two completely separate worlds are clashing. And then you get into who Cortés is as a person and what his motivations are. You know, it's just another layer to this really in-depth, really fascinating story.
Yeah, I think I always go back to that whole motif of clash of civilizations, right? The meeting of two worlds. And I think that is what draws me to this particular chapter of history so much, because it's just so fascinating. And I think, like, historically speaking, we kind of take it for granted because we're so interconnected. It's very easy for us to understand, or at least see and view different cultures. Whereas, in the late 1480s, early 1500s, this was the first time that either parties had seen each other for the first time. Like, they didn't even know they existed, right? And I think that, to me, is one of the coolest, probably, takeaways from doing episodes like this.
I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head there. And the other thing that I come to is, we learned a lot about Canadian and American history growing up, and you learn a lot about clashes with the indigenous Native Americans. But this is just so different because you have a lot of nomadic tribes in North America. It's not really big, large cities. There's no empires. There's confederacies and things like that. But when we look at the Aztecs, right, this is massive main city, capital city with a huge empire, and really is very similar to what a European or Asian or from the Middle East, like one of those empires would look like.
Yep.
But, just much more primitive from a technological standpoint. And so to see those two come together, it is very different, because I don't really think anything else like that ever happens, to the point where, like you were saying, that they have no contact. We see lots of Europeans moving into Africa and into parts in China and different places like that, but they all kind of knew that these people existed. This wasn't a massive shock, but this is just like a bunch of guys show up on your doorstep, and a decade later, your entire empire is destroyed, and a huge amount of your population is dead. I don't think there's anything else that even comes close to that in history. And like we said, it really is like this alien invasion that can't be stopped.
Yeah, 100%. I think, like, again, just to double down on that, like, just for a second, imagine how the worldview of these two party changes with first contact, right? Like, their world now has become infinitely larger to a degree they probably can't even comprehend. That's why I think, like, bookending these conversations with Montezuma and, like, Hernán Cortés is so fascinating, because I'm not going to say they're in direct opposition to each other. I probably could say that, but, like, historically, culturally, socially, what they start to represent when we look at them, like, with a contrast and comparison, I think it really makes for an interesting discussion.
For sure. It's the clashing of worlds, the clashing of ideologies, but then two men who were very, very different But when you kind of break them down, they're ambitious, they're powerful, they want the best for themselves and for the people around them. They are leaders, and that's what we do here, right? So to kick off this story, I think it's important that we just take a quick second to set the scene a little bit on Spain and the colonization efforts that are going on in the Caribbean and then moving into Central America. So we've done a few episodes on the Spanish and their explorations. So we've talked about Queen Isabella. We've also talked about Christopher Columbus. So just to give a quick recap, Queen Isabella marries Ferdinand of Aragon, which unites the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, which eventually becomes what we know today as Spain. During that time, the Castilian crown is starting to consolidate their power within the Iberian Peninsula, kicking out the Moors out of Spain and really making all of Spain a very Catholic state. And part of this involves sending Columbus on 4 expeditions to the New World, where he lands in the Caribbean. And it's really interesting how quickly things change. Queen Isabella is very explicit that when Columbus and the other explorers go to the Caribbean and meet these indigenous people, that they're not to be enslaved, they're to be treated with respect, they're to be baptized as Christians, and they are to be taken into the Spanish Empire as subjects of Queen Isabella. Sounds like a great idea. However, Columbus, being the first one to go over there, already breaks that rule and brings back some Taínos, which are a native group from Hispaniola, which today is the Dominican Republic and Haiti. Brings them back, and they're in just terrible health and terrible order. And Queen Isabella gets very, very upset about this. And you'd think, okay, maybe this is going to turn things around. Fast forward about 15, 20 years, Queen Isabella has passed away, new leadership in Spain, and the Spanish are in full colonization mode of Hispaniola. And some historians say Hispaniola has been turned into basically hell on earth. The indigenous population is enslaved. They're working in the mines because they found gold, which is the classic story with Spanish conquistadors. They're always looking for gold. They almost have this lust for gold that they can't seem to shake. And they're forcing the indigenous population to work in mines and do all this manual labor of some sort. There's revolts. Then they're put down really aggressively. And it's just a horrible, horrible place. And then on top of that, there is a massive smallpox epidemic, which is burning through the Taíno population. So the Spanish are looking at this going, well, that's not good because that's our workforce and they're all dying off from this disease. And this is when we start to see the first African slaves being brought into Hispaniola. So that's why when we see a lot of African influences in the Caribbean and other places in Central America, all kind of starts from the indigenous populations getting killed or killed and dying off due to disease, and then African slaves coming in to kind of fill in that gap. So we're really at a point here where, the Spanish are coming in from this very, you'd call it almost entrepreneurial standpoint, where it's let's develop these businesses and let's develop these enterprises, but at not as a way we would think a typical entrepreneur works. This is a very just ruthless type of concept here. So it's not a great place to be. And the Spanish are, continuing to push this world. And this is a world that Cortés comes into. He sees a lot of these men going over to the New World, looking for riches and really not caring how they do it. And so on top of this too, Catholicism is massive. This is a really big point of the Spanish. And it's really the number one priority of the Spanish crown is to spread Catholicism to the world and, use it as a way of controlling the people that are under them. But they also genuinely believe that being Catholic, being Christian is the most important thing for everybody in the world. So we have this weird kind of juxtaposition of, yes, we want to be good Catholics, we want to be good Christians, but yet we're going to enslave populations because we need gold and at all costs. So that's kind of where we're at. And it's a tricky point for a lot of people involved, and it only gets worse, unfortunately.
I think it's a really good overview. I think there's just a couple of things we'd probably want to keep in mind, and a couple of things that stood out to me that I think also came through in my research. One was like the Taíno population. You mentioned smallpox and the epidemic that would ultimately run through, and that kind of being one of the trigger points of bringing in African slaves into the New World. But this like transmission of disease, right? It plays a huge role in this colonization effort in the New World, and we'll see the role it played in the conquest of the Aztec Empire when it came to Hernán Cortés and, the forces with him. But it's funny because we can't undermine the role that germs played in the colonization of the New World. And there's a great book called Guns, Germs, and Steel by a historian that looks at this kind of trinity as being key proponents in how Europe was able to actually colonize and conquer the New World so effectively. And disease is a huge part of it.
Absolutely. It's this hidden weapon that the Spanish didn't even know they had. And it's just gets so so out of control so quickly that there's really no defense for it. And even if the Spanish wanted to come in and be nice guys about everything, there's very little they can do about this, because smallpox is showing up one way or another, whether it's through trading vessels or a full-on invasion like we ended up seeing. So there's not really much that can be done. And it's a really unfortunate thing that happens, because it just kind of burns through real quick. And there's a lot of Catholic friars and monks that go over, and they're looking at this and saying, my goodness, like, what is happening? What are we doing? We need to respect these people. We need to treat them. We need to do these better things. But this lust for gold, right? This lust for power is so ingrained in what the Spanish do. And I did a little bit of research too on why gold, right? We always talk about gold as
a great question.
Why is it so great? And it was actually a really simple answer. And the reason is it's divisible very easily. You can get a chest of gold coins and you can hand it to your men and they can do what they need with it. It doesn't rot. It doesn't decay. It's going to last forever. And it's portable. You can throw a chest on a ship and take it away, where you can't do that with land. You can't do that necessarily with a big palace. Again, obviously it's shiny and it looks nice and people like it for that. But that is the piece, right? If you can find gold, you can easily bring it back to Spain and live this luxurious life and set your family up for the future. And that's what a lot of these conquistadors are thinking. And there's a great historian who says, he calls them armed entrepreneurs, who basically say, like, think of some of the great entrepreneurs of our day, but give them guns and weapons and just see what would happen, because they have this burning ambition to make a lot of money, to be successful, but they got a bunch of weapons and guns. So they're going to be really, really ruthless in, achieving their end goals. And
I think we are going to see the ruthlessness and the savagery that really does start to materialize during the conquest.
Yeah, it doesn't end, unfortunately. And just one kind of quote here that I have about the conquistadors that I think we can just use as a segue into Cortés's life is the conquistadors. If you were to describe them in 3 words, it was gold, God, and glory. So that's what they're there for. Nothing more, nothing less. And we'll see how that plays a huge part in this story.
Great transition point. I think something that I walked away with, and we can discuss it at the end, Paul, when we kind of debrief. I think for Cortés doing research, is he a product of his times? The age of exploration, Columbus, everything that's going on. Who is he? How did he get there? And I think that's something I kept coming back to, and I kept doing that comparison with Columbus a bit, because I think it's a very apt one. But we'll see. And I think there's so much to his life that really does inform, what he would ultimately turn into, or, the actions that we would see later in his life in the New World. But we can kick off and just try to get a sense of, his adolescence. Because I think, one of the things I've walked away with during these episodes is that you can start to glean a lot of personality and character traits
definitely
in a young person that seem to really impact how they operate as adults, which, we're not a psychology podcast, but I think that's definitely something we've seen quite consistently throughout our episodes.
We're amateur historians. I think we can be amateur psychologists every now and then. I'll give us that. Yeah, why not?
So for Cortés, he's kind of born into a family that is of lesser nobility. That's not saying, that they're not well off, but, relatively speaking, they, weren't the wealthiest and they weren't the poorest. So somewhere in the middle, but they did have enough resources to, provide him with a decent upbringing. And this kind of gave him a taste of nobility without the actual privileges of wealth. When he was young, he was sent to study at the University of Salamanca, which was of someone of his upper middle class lifestyle, was somewhat normal, and essentially was preparing him for a career in law. However, his stay at university was very short-lived. Historians suggest that he wasn't very interested in the confines of a classroom and was much more interested in adventure and exploration. And, his ambitions, really did start manifesting quite early. To your point, Paul, that you kind of raised before we jumped into it, was that, he grew up during the Reconquista. So Spanish Christians are fighting to reclaim their land from the Moors. This period is also marked by very strong military ethos and a focus on territorial expansion. If we look at the late 15th and early 16th centuries, this is what I would call the age of exploration, the age of discovery, whatever you want to call it. You have Columbus's voyages to the New World beginning in 1492, which really, if you're someone like Cortés, who's ambitious, interested in discovery, has ambition to be wealthy, he grew up in a world of new possibilities and dreams of fortune fortune, which were probably, all around him, which, what young man wouldn't that entice if you've already got it in you a little bit?
Exactly. And he's also growing up in a very violent world too. The Reconquista was not a nice time for anybody, right? There's a lot of war and a lot of bloodshed. And like you said too, the going for glory and fame and all of these sort of things, like before Spain being very fractured into multiple kingdoms and nobody really knowing what tomorrow is going to look like. You finally get a little bit of this unification. You see this great queen come forward and everybody kind of seeing what one individual person can do to a country. That's got to be inspiring to a lot of these people. And now Spain being so powerful, having the money to say, you know what, we don't need to worry so much about domestic affairs. We can send boats across the ocean and see what they find. And if they don't come back with anything, not great, but it's not the end of the world for us.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's a perfect scenario for someone who's got any sort of ambition, but also has to be in a point in their life where they're not comfortable either. Because if you have a cozy life in Spain,
you're not going to give it up.
Yeah. You're not crossing the Atlantic and hacking through jungles trying to find some gold, right?
No, he's not being welcomed by roads, infrastructure, anything like what Spain has to offer if you're living a comfortable life there. But really, again, like to your point, it is really a great environment for someone to have these dreams and possibilities of like wealth, fame, social advancement through exploration. So as well as conquest. So you can see how it's a very powerful motivator. And before we kind of pivot to his career or like his activities in the New World, so his career wasn't just on exploration, but he actually served as a notary and a clerk in Spain. So, and after the fact, he was able to turn towards adventure and he joined an expedition to the New World, departing for Hispaniola in 1504. And essentially, this is the turning point, starting a journey into becoming a conquistador, which would essentially, reshape North America as we know it. So if we pivot to his actual arrival in Hispaniola, so when he arrives, he's entered into a world of like colonial opportunity and exploitation. He's a notary there and later a landowner. He gains firsthand experience in colonial administration, the encomienda system where Spanish settlers were granted land along with the right to use indigenous labor. So this kind of gave him some really early, but I would imagine very useful experience into the complexities of managing and running businesses or farms or landscape in the New World and how you could essentially leverage it for his own personal gain.
And I even think with him, though, he's getting a little bit of that experience, but he's not a governor. He's not a general. He's a notary, right? Like it's an important job, but it's not what you would think of. Oh, this guy's going to go conquer the Aztecs and run Mexico for as many years as he can, right? He's a little bit of just kind of a guy who's doing some things. He's working the administration, but he's not someone you would tap on the shoulder and say, oh, you should be the one to go you should be the one to go figure out what's going on in the center of Mexico, which is very odd why he ends up becoming that person. But, it doesn't really, you'd be hard pressed to figure out why he would get picked versus maybe somebody else.
100%. Like from relative obscurity to being a stalwart in history books, right? Like it's quite the leap that he makes. And I think it kind of starts with the conquest of Cuba in 1511. So Cortés joins Diego Velázquez in the conquest of Cuba. He kind of witnesses the brutality, but the rewards of conquest. His participation in that campaign, again, provides some experience. It teaches him about military tactics, governance, the treatment of indigenous people. But his performance also earned him some influence, including the mayorship of Santiago de Cuba. So you can see, again, his willingness to learn, his willingness to take risks, get in the front is paying off. He goes from notary to essentially, a public administrator at a higher level of government. And then in 1518, he's appointed to lead an expedition to Mexico. So again, another opportunity which he rises to the occasion for. He showcases his skills in organization to inspire loyalty in others. You start seeing some of these budding leadership qualities come out. He gathers ships, men, supplies. He's able to logistically plan the expedition. However, at this point, the relationship between Cortés and Velázquez kind of sours. It actually leads to Velázquez revoking his command, and Cortés ultimately decides to defy him and proceed anyway as a very bold and rebellious mood. And then, to me, essentially, seek forgiveness later, right? Like, just do what you got to do at this point. And it seems like nothing was going to stop him from actually executing against his expedition.
I think it's really important when you say this, because this is, we have to put ourselves in Montezuma's shoes, right? Cortés shows up. He's representing the Spanish crown and saying that I represent Spain, but he's a criminal. quite frankly, he's defied orders. His boss has said, you do not take those ships and you do not go because they belong to the Spanish crown. And he said, screw it, I'm going anyways. And Velasquez tries to stop him, but is unable to. So Cortés is sailing off as essentially a rogue commander going to claim things for Spain. And so it's important to understand that, because if you start to think of what are his motivations, right? He can't just go on a little scouting party, discover some things and come back, because Velasquez will probably throw him in prison or even worse. He really needs to make sure that he finds something special so he can, write back to the King of Spain saying, look what I found. And then whatever pull Velasquez has is not going to be able to supersede whatever he's done.
Exactly.
So it's a really, really interesting piece. And I wonder too, Richie, like, do you think Velasquez maybe picked him because he thought, hey, maybe Mexico, he'll do some stuff, but he eventually will fail. And then I will be able to take over. Or I struggle to understand why he would pick Cortés, because clearly something happens where he realizes maybe Cortés is more ambitious than I thought, or he's more.
I think that's it.
You think that's it?
I think that's it. I think he saw something in him and then realized, again, we are total conjecture at this point. But I am of the opinion that I think he saw his ambition, which he initially thought could be, kind of reined in a little bit, and then ultimately probably saw that there was no reining in his ambition or motivation to do things to get power and influence. And I think Velasquez probably recognized that and saw that as a huge risk, not only for what they were trying to do, but, to his own stake and where he was positioned.
Yeah, because I'm sure Velasquez has his own ambitions as well, right? And if 100%. He sends off this really ambitious guy who finds this city of gold, which they keep hearing about all the time, who's to say that Cortés doesn't do all of this, and then the King of Spain is so happy that he gives him Cuba and command of the entire Americas? Like, you just don't know, right?
Don't know. Yeah, exactly. No, and I think this is a great point, right, that you just made about he's there in defiance. So when he gets to Mexico, he marches toward Tenochtitlan and he has the first contact with the Aztecs. He's able to really, strangely enough, like, be very diplomatic. He is putting up this front that he is actually this very powerful figure who is actually trying to manage these interactions while trying to understand the strength and structure of the Aztec Empire. Trying to, with surgeon-like precision, I imagine, to figure out what the fault points are, what the weak points are, what he could take advantage of, how is this going to align with his ambitions. And I think, again, he is very exploitive. I think you're seeing that in his journey thus far. Like, he's willing to take advantage of opportunities, and not just take advantage. He's willing to totally exploit any opportunity given to him, regardless of, the impact it's going to have on anyone else.
Yeah, he's definitely thinking about what comes next, right? Who's going to be the person that's going to come and take this from me? Or how do I make sure I'm the first one to do this? And there's a great story about Cortés and the conquistadors here. So there's this really interesting thing with the Spanish, and we mentioned it a bit last time about how legalistic they are, and everything that they do is to protect themselves from getting sued down the line. So there's an interesting story about Cortés where there's like a kind of a folk tale that he burned his ships when he got to the New World to say, well, there's no going back. What he actually did was he beached his ships so you don't want to leave them in the sea. And they started to take some wood from that, and they created a little town called Veracruz, which translates to the New Cross. And the first thing they did was they said, you know what? We need a mayor of this town. And Cortés goes, you know what, guys? I'm no longer in command. I relinquish my command, but we're all going to vote on who should be the mayor of this town. And Richie, I'll give you $5 if you can guess who unanimously is picked as the mayor of this town.
It just goes to show you, right? Like, right. He's very adept at being able to. He's almost like a shrewd politician.
Absolutely,
in a way, right? Like,
he's a lawyer too, in a sense, right? Because he knows he's a notary, right? So in this sense, he's saying, I'm now the mayor of this town. I have a legal claim to this town. So if Velasquez ever tries to come back at me and say you're some rogue, he's like, well, I'm the legally elected mayor of this town. Now you have no jurisdiction here. Like, it's actually quite brilliant when you think about it.
It is. And I think that goes to kind of showcase how much of a tactician he is, right? He's able to leverage all of his experience and knowledge into kind of just leapfrogging some of these barriers that he was presented with. I think this is a great time to kind of pivot probably into the actual conquest of the empire itself. So I think it's safe to say at this point, he's not just a conquistador. By the time he reaches the Aztec Empire, he is a shrewd politician. He's a strategist. And he's about to face one of the most powerful empires in the Americas. So the conquest itself actually culminates around 1522. It's ruthless. It's tactical. He leverages multiple native indigenous alliances. And the most interesting one that I think we're going to spend a little bit of time on is his relationship with La Malinche, or Doña Marina, who is a Nahuatl woman who played a vital role as his interpreter, advisor, intermediary. She was also a mother of his son. She was captured by the Mayans and later given to Cortés. She kind of possessed this linguistic skill, which eventually, or ultimately became invaluable to him. It allowed Cortés to communicate with various indigenous groups, and she almost became her own strategist, right, Paul? I think there is something very intriguing and interesting about the role that she plays in this particular chapter of history.
She is probably the most interesting person I think I've ever read about, just because we know so little about her motivations. Mm-hmm. But she's so important to this story, because think about it. Cortés shows up and he needs to negotiate with Montezuma. He doesn't speak Nahuatl. Montezuma doesn't speak Spanish. So there's this crazy story before they even get Malinche into their group. Is the Spanish arrive in the New World, and they're basically sending out messages with these different indigenous tribes that they run into, saying, the Spanish are here. If there's any Spanish people out there, come to the coast. We're here. And one day this canoe shows up, and this Spanish guy is in the canoe, and he's basically explains to them that years earlier, he was on a ship that was headed for Jamaica. They hit a storm and got essentially shipwrecked in the Yucatan Peninsula, and they were captured by the Mayans. There was also some cannibals in the area. So some of them were killed and eaten, which is another thing.
That's crazy.
But a few of them survive. One actually goes full native, and, he gets the tattoos and the piercings, kind of like a Mayan native would at the time, marries a Mayan woman, has children. But then this other guy, whose name is Aguilar, comes to the coast and he says, I'm here, Cortés, like I'm Spanish. And, he tells this incredible story. But the most important thing is he's been captured by the Mayans and living with the Mayans. So he understands Mayan now. So this is huge. Like, what a stroke of luck for Cortés, right? Now he has someone who speaks Mayan and someone who speaks Spanish. That's perfect. In his mind, he goes, I have a translator. So he eventually finds his way over to where the Aztecs are, which is more in the central area of Mexico. And he starts talking to the Aztecs. And Aguilar starts to listen to these people and kind of looks back at Cortés and goes, oh my God, I have no idea what these people are saying, because they're speaking Nahuatl and they don't understand that. And by this stroke of luck, when you, like you were saying, Malinche and these other group of women are essentially given / sold to Cortés as, quite frankly, sexual slaves of some type, housekeepers, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Malinche is one of them. And so Malinche, like you were saying, she was born in a Nahuatl speaking community, which we believe was paying tribute to the Aztecs. So she grew up in a world where she does not like the Aztecs. She's probably seen them kill a lot of her family members, distaste for the Aztecs because they're paying tribute to them and all of these sort of things. So she's definitely not a fan of them. And then at some point in her life, we really don't know, even what her name was when she was born. But at some point, she was sold into slavery or kidnapped, and then into a Mayan slave market. And so now she speaks Nahuatl, she speaks Mayan. And so now, when she's in Cortés's possession, we now have this triangle of language where Malinche can translate Nahuatl into Mayan, and Aguilar can translate Mayan into Spanish. And now we have this weird triangle that, again, strokes of luck. And we see this in history, right? You got to be lucky, even no matter how smart you are. And so now Cortés has a translator who can speak multiple languages. And then Malinche, eventually just being around the Spanish, clearly is very clever with languages, is able to pick up Spanish and be his official translator when he meets Montezuma and the rest of the Aztecs.
It's just one of those things, right? Like, of history, the randomness that just seems to happen at times. Like, if it wasn't for her, would we even be having this conversation now? Or how different could this conversation look is always something that strikes me. And, I think there is absolutely in no reasonable way, shape, or form that we can downplay the impact that she had on what would ultimately be the conquest and overthrowing of the Aztec Empire.
It's absolutely essential, because we mentioned it last week, and it's important to say it again, is when the conquistadors are fighting against the Aztecs, we have in our head, there was a handful of Spanish beat a huge Aztec army. That's a very false statement, because yes, there was a handful of Spanish, but there was also a ton of other indigenous tribes and groups that were fighting back against the Aztecs. So for Cortés, if he can't speak any local language, how is he going to build all of these alliances? He's going to point at things and maybe show some trinkets and stuff like that. But how are you going to strategize? How are you going to understand who's friend, who's foe, who's going to stab you in the back? Malinche has to do all of this for him. And I hope the listeners have picked up on this, because the most interesting thing that we don't really know for sure is what the heck is she telling Cortés? She talks to some guy who speaks a language, doesn't know. She translates it back. Is she flat out lying? Is she telling the truth? Is she spinning it for her own purposes? Because remember, we assume she really has a distaste for the Aztecs and would love to see them destroyed. So when he's talking to Montezuma, what is she doing? We don't know, which I think makes it so fascinating, because she could say anything. What does Cortés know? He has no idea. The true power of these negotiations are in the hands of essentially one obscure woman who ends up becoming one of the most important people in this entire story, if not in world history. It's insane.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way we could undermine the role that she had. I think to another point you just made around like the strategic alliances. So this is just Cortés and his merry band of armed entrepreneurs, right?
Exactly.
More or less. So without these alliances and strategic alliances with other rival groups, this is close to impossible. Unless the Spanish come with backups, there's almost no way that this is going to be done in a very effortless way. And I think, again, to Cortés's credit, he's able to make alliances with traditional enemies of the Aztecs, a very strategic move, which allows him to bolster his forces with, thousands of indigenous warriors, which are obviously going to be crucial in the siege of Tenochtitlan. And the partnership is obviously marked by mutual benefits to a certain degree, right? And you can see this as kind of this colonial playbook that happens in the New World, which is, they needed manpower, they needed local knowledge, and the enemies of the Aztecs saw an opportunity to overthrow their oppressors. So some mutual benefit there for them.
Yeah, and when we look at part of the world, we definitely always run into that place of indigenous versus, conquerors. And I guess as we start to peel the onion back, we see how complex and how much interplay there is, and how we talked about last week, how the Aztecs are actually not indigenous to Mexico. They're actually conquerors from the north. Yep. And so a lot of these, I guess we could say, true indigenous tribes are like, okay, we got one invader. We have a chance to kick them out from these people who we're not really sure what their motivations are, but short-term thinking, hey, this could be a great idea. And 100%. For some, it actually works out quite well. Like I think it's the Tlaxcalans who are a group that help against the Aztecs, and they live semi-independently. They're essentially reporting up into the King of Spain, but they're able to live in their own republic for, decades and decades, until they kind of get amalgamated into the Mexican country when it kind of finally gets formed. So for them, it worked out great. And, outside of the smallpox, which I think doesn't see boundaries, doesn't see borders, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is always the thing. It's like everything was good except the disease that wiped out, 70% of their population, which is, again, staggering numbers when you put it in terms like that.
And I think this is where, this is where the numbers get a little difficult to pin down, obviously. Like how much can we trust these records? And, as we kind of do the lead up into the siege of Tenochtitlan, there's essentially, they're marching towards Tenochtitlan. Cortés and his men, they stop at Cholula, which is a city that's allied with the Aztecs. So here, under the pretext of a peaceful visit, Cortés essentially orchestrates a brutal massacre. Spanish forces and their allies, so the indigenous tribes that are there, kill thousands of unarmed Cholula nobles and citizens. Essentially, to me, this is a clear display of his ruthlessness, which, I assume he wanted to serve as a warning for other cities about the consequences of resisting his forces. This is probably one of the more chilling things I think I've read as a part of this research. So, a bit of context. Cholula is an important city-state in central Mexico at this time. They are allied with the Aztec Empire. So there's a betrayal that happens, right? He goes there under this peaceful kind of pretext. Tensions start to escalate between him and the indigenous people, largely, I would assume through cultural misunderstandings, possible instigations of who he's with and who he's allied with. Cortés ultimately receives information, likely from La Malinche, and suggests that the Cholulans, possibly at the behest of the Aztecs, are going to attack the Spanish. And Paul, to your point, right? again, conjecture, but super interesting. Is this the truth? Did she make it up? What was her intentions, right? And I think this is like the mystique and the mystery around this decision. So, Malinche potentially tells Cortés, someone tells Cortés, possibly Malinche, that they're going to attack the Spanish. Whether this threat is real or fabricated, historians can't decide. But this gives Cortés the go-ahead to essentially attack. So he ends up gathering as many of the Cholula nobles and leaders under the guise of a peaceful meeting. Once they're assembled, the Spaniards and their allies launched a very brutal attack. They essentially slaughtered priests, citizens. It was a relentless killing spree defined by Spanish accounts. Soldiers used swords and crossbows against the defenseless population, and the indigenous Tlaxcans kind of seized the opportunity to exact revenge on an old enemy. And, there was just constant bloodshed that followed.
Yeah, who's really pulling the strings here, right? Is this...
Who's the puppet master?
Yeah, exactly. Is it just pure brutality and just evil behavior from Cortés? Is the Tlaxcalans saying, like you said, is this the way to get back at an old enemy? And we're able to rile up Cortés in such a way to say, like, if you don't destroy these people, they're going to come and stab you in the back and, in the night. Or where's Malinche into this? Did she make a mistake when translating? Did she use the wrong word because she's still new to these languages? We'll never really know, but all we do know is the outcome was unbelievably horrible. And, when you hear, we talked about last week, steel against wooden clubs and obsidian, it's a bloodbath, and it's
100%.
There's just no way that these forces are going to be able to withstand the power of these Spanish troops, plus the sheer numbers of their indigenous allies as well.
Yeah, and I think, the city itself is plundered and burned, and the number of dead, estimates range from hundreds to several thousands. But ultimately what this does is that it's a warning. It's an example to other city-states about the consequences of opposing Cortés and his allies. And as an amateur historian, if I take that analysis a bit deeper, I think it shows his willingness to use extreme violence at any reason that's required to be able to achieve his objectives and instill fear in the surrounding indigenous communities and populations.
And it's a different type of warfare that the Aztecs have never seen before. The Aztecs, like we talked about last week, they did things called flower wars, basically, where it's much more of a spectacle where you're trying to capture the enemy to bring him back to sacrifice him. You're not besieging cities and cutting off supply lines like the Spanish are. And so the Aztecs are like, oh, okay, well, we'll have a very spectacle-based war or battle and, fight like how we've always fought. But now we have no food and we're potentially going to get starved out. They probably don't have like a European fort might have of just food in reserve just in case they're besieged. Like, it's just not a concept that they're used to.
100%. I think these are some lessons learned, or, definitely a part of the strategy that was used to actually seize Tenochtitlan. So, if we move forward, I won't go too much into the details of the encounter with Montezuma and Cortés, because listen to our previous episode. Cortés' first meeting with the emperor is essentially this critical moment. He's received as a guest, and he soon takes Montezuma hostage, essentially, and he gains control over Tenochtitlan. And, it just goes to show you how ruthless and tactical he was. Like, within, such little time, he's already controlling and using Montezuma against his will to make decisions, policy decisions, religious decisions that are going to better improve his chances of kind of taking over the city. So essentially, the situation becomes untenable here, and we talk about it in detail in the last episode. But essentially, there's an uprising, and during this uprising, known as the Sad Night or La Noche Triste, Cortés suffers significant losses. However, instead of deterring him, I think this hardened his resolve, and the siege essentially kicks off here. And this is a brutal campaign. And to your point, Paul, I think this is a confluence of like European military strategy to starve them out. You have smallpox outbreaks, which in many ways really supported the Spanish effort, and you're seeing relentless combat. And the Spanish and their allies are essentially able to blockade the city. They cut off supplies and water, and the final assault on the city is pretty merciless, with widespread destruction, massive loss of life. And essentially, Tenochtitlan falls and kind of marks the end of the Aztec Empire, and an extremely significant victory for Cortés.
It's incredibly it's this one of the most sad things I think we've read, because we talked last week about this city and just how unbelievably beautiful it was. Even the Spanish are rolling and going, oh my goodness, this is paradise. And, one of the things I think with the Sad Night is, and just I think it's important to talk about, because when we talk about, okay, Cortés is in the city meeting with Montezuma, there's an uprising, and then he's invading, or he's besieged the city. He's got to get out of that city first. And that's even crazier about, like, they're sneaking off in the night, and then someone goes, hey, there they are. And then the whole city erupts. And you just hear this story of this Spanish, again, trying to bring all this gold with them. And what we talked about last week about Tenochtitlan is it's this Venetian style city with canals and causeways and surrounded by water. So they're trying to escape. The Aztecs are cutting them off. They're trying to carry their gold. They have their slaves trying to carry gold. Most of it falls into the water. Men are drowning, and it's just a bloodbath for essentially no real purpose. And after they take the city, they're essentially taking all the nobles from the town, being like, all right, we've got the city. Show us where the gold is. And in this really just sad, pathetic way, they look at them and go, you took all the gold. And you lost it. You dropped it all into the water. So either this is a very clever lie, or they're like, what do you mean you've stolen everything from us and you still want more? It's just, it breaks your heart, because again, the Aztecs are not these wonderful people who are just the most pious people in the world. But again, their culture has been destroyed for, oh my God, we need gold and we need power. And then they just go and lose most of it and don't actually have this gold. And now this obsession with gold will just continue, and the same story is going to keep happening, where they hear that the town over has even more gold, so they destroy that town, and then they realize there's no gold there, and they got to move on to the next one until eventually they get a little bit of order into place. But yeah, it's just a sad ending to one of the great empires, and just for what, right? It's for the promise of gold that may or may not have even existed.
Yeah, it is a very saddening end. And I think one of the things that stayed with me, and probably a little bit of a tangent related to our last episode, and I think it really just ties into what we're talking about today when it comes to this kind of clash of worlds and clash of civilizations, is, a question we pondered was, why did Montezuma just kind of fall in line with Cortez's efforts? Right. And I think that's something I thought about a little bit after our actual discussion. And I think he sees the writing on the wall. And I think, right. And that to me is probably one of the more sadder realizations historically, which is like, he's come to the conclusion that regardless of whatever they do with Cortés at this point, there's going to be more men like him. They could be worse. And what's going to happen ultimately is that they're going to come and take everything from us and overpower us and have technology that we can't even begin to comprehend. So he falls in line.
He does. And it's a chilling thought, because he thinks that Cortés represents the Spanish. He thinks he's an envoy. He's some sort of representation, but essentially he's a thug and a criminal, legalistically speaking, because we know the Spanish love the legality of things. He's defied orders. He's there purely for gold, glory, and God. And you know what I mean? Like, it's for what? What is the purpose of, outside of just, he wants to make a name for himself. He wants to take this. He wants to be in power. And Montezuma has no idea that this is not representative of what would have happened if he sent envoys to Spain and said, let's have a conversation about how we can, work together and we can trade and do all of these things, because he's seen the worst of the worst. But what he probably doesn't realize either is the motivation of people now coming to that land. It's just Cortés 2.0 and people even worse than him, sometimes better, but mostly worse, who have that lust for gold, and just, they're going to keep, that machine is going to keep moving forward until they can get a little bit of control over that land. And it's a lot of just rogue armed entrepreneurs at this point.
Yeah. And I think, to really just put a pin on like the actual, fall of the empire, I think it's probably worthwhile to say, like, the siege lasted several months, right? Like, this wasn't a one and done kind of. The Aztecs put up a very, very noble fight, but eventually, because of the strategy and approach that Cortés used, they ultimately were susceptible to the enormous loss of life through starvation, and it ultimately led to the collapse of their civilization. And then, here's Cortés now as someone who has essentially been earmarked in the history books for destroying one of the greatest empires the world's probably ever known.
Yeah, and he's even he continues that, he's destroyed the Aztec Empire, but he wants more gold. And there's a story of essentially Montezuma's replacement. They torture him and they say, where's the gold? And one of the things they do is I think they have burning oil. They pour it on his feet as a way of torturing him. And there's this story where they pour the oil on his feet and he kind of just smiles. And he's kind of gone into Mexican folklore as the Montezuma has a little bit of a negative reception because of him kind of giving into the Spanish, where his replacement was kind of brought into the world where, he already sees the writing on the wall is already, written in ink, and he's seen as this kind of last defiant person against the Spanish. And then, of course, there's a rumor that he's trying to kill Cortés and the conquistadors hang him on a tree somewhere. It's just this pathetic kind of waste of life. And you think, again, this person has some sort of pull, but again, they're so worried about losing their power because this is not a world where nobility and kingship and bloodlines are controlling things from a Spanish perspective. It's essentially, again, armed capitalists where it's just survival of the fittest. Whoever's the strongest, whoever has the most money,
that's it,
is going to be powerful. And you see this throughout this entire period. A conquistador leaves the city that they've taken over to go hunt for some other gold or whatever it might be. And they come back and they find out that someone's deposed them and the place is in ruins and it's just mayhem and they just can't seem to really get control. And that's essentially the story of the conquistadors, is its obsession for gold and God. And they get what they want. It's a short-term gain. And then they don't have the skill to hold on to these things because everybody's just at each other's throats. And then they're stuck in court for 20 years because the Spanish love to sue each other back then. And yeah, it's just it's a waste. It's kind of a word that keeps coming to mind for me.
Yeah, no. And I think to your point about the Spanish always being embroiled in legal battles, it's almost ironic that that's how Cortés would spend his later years. So if we kind of see what happens, it's funny because like we talk about Cortés, we talk about the conquest, and we kind of just stop. Most people aren't really too concerned about what happens post-conquest. And for some reason, I don't know what it is with these like adventurer, explorer, age of discovery types, but it doesn't usually end very well with a lot of notoriety, more infamy and impoverished living than anything. I don't know, Paul. I don't like. Are you seeing that as well?
Oh, for sure. There's some story too about a pretty brutal conquistador who was on a mission. His horse slips, falls on him, and then a boulder comes and lands on his head and crushes him. And you're just like, well, damn. That's just what happens, right? So it's, from everything that I've seen, it's either these guys die in some sort of obscurity, caught up in legal battles, they've lost a lot of their money, or they die in search of whatever next thing that's coming, right? These guys have this mentality of, I need the next big thing. They're almost kind of like an addiction, right? Of you got to have the next 100%. Thing. You can't just sit back and be happy with what you got. And a lot of them, die hacking their way through the jungle. They die of disease. They die running into hostile native troops. And yeah, it's weird how I came into this too with, you kind of have this, like the conquistadors almost have this glamorous view to them of these men in this beautiful armor showing up and commanding all this control and being a really organized force. Like that's kind of the thought that I had in my head, which has completely been flipped on its head. This is, again, they're not even 100%. Soldiers, which I thought was even crazy. These are just guys showing up. Some of them may have been soldiers, but it's not like the Spanish army is going in there and they're very well trained or anything. It's the complete opposite.
Yeah. It's just like a ragtag group of guys.
It is, yeah.
And like to your point, I think you kind of nailed it. Like you pretty much summarized, the last chapter of his life. So like post-conquest, after the fall of the empire, he's named governor and captain general of New Spain. He runs his administration, pretty seamlessly. He restructures the land under Spanish control, but man, his appetites are not satiated. He embarks on further expeditions to extend Spanish rule. So he has expeditions to Honduras or the Baja region. And these ventures, a little bit of foreshadowing here to your point, Paul, these ventures are more or less successful than what he imagines they're going to be, and they drain much of his wealth. And then in New Spain, he is continually challenged. He faces numerous legal battles, both in the New World and Spain. His relationship with the crown is complex, to say the least. While he's recognized for his achievements, he's also viewed with great suspicion due to his growing power and autonomy in the New World. They must realize how he got there, how he gained power, and now they're probably stuck in a very tough situation about what to do with him.
Yeah, and there's a lot of rumors going around about him. I don't know. Did you read anything about his wife and what happened to her?
I didn't know.
Okay, so he goes to Cuba originally with Velázquez, and Velázquez forces him to marry, I believe, a family member of Velázquez. They're married for about a year, and then Cortés goes on his mission, does what he needs to do. He takes Tenochtitlan. He's living there, has all this. There's rumors that he's got many, many women living in his palace. And his wife is at this point where she's like, he hasn't called for me yet. Like, you'd think he'd send a ship or something to bring me now that the war's over. And that never happens. So her and her sister go, all right, we're going to pick up and we're going to go to Tenochtitlan and we're going to find Cortés. And she shows up, and then the way it's kind of reported is he kind of gives her a look of like, oh, hi. I forgot about you. And at some point they're overheard having an argument. They go to bed, and then Cortés wakes up and goes, oh my goodness, something terrible has happened. My wife has passed away, in the night. And the rumors immediately start that he strangled her, or, she walked out of an open window or fell out of an open window, something like that.
Sure,
very Vladimir
yeah.
Putin of him, right? So we don't know for sure. It's obviously rumor, but again, this man is not a trustworthy man. So the years of legal battles and everybody kind of looking at him out of the corner of their eye saying, I'm not really going to trust everything you have to say because you may have murdered your wife. Yeah. It all kind of comes together and sets, I think, a narrative for Cortés.
And I think it just goes again to kind of speak of his legacy, right? Like he's the guy shrouded in these kind of dubious, amoral decisions that he often makes for, that kind of seems like convenient rather than any real strategy. Like, I don't want my wife here, so I'm just going to get rid of her.
Exactly. Yeah. She's just getting in the way.
You just put her on a ship and send her back. But
I know you're the lord of this area with a lot of money. But you had to murder her because I think too he's at this point where he's been very, very violent, and he's been in this supreme leader sort of role where the king of Spain's across the ocean, any word that he gets of what's going on is going to be 6 months later, and by the time orders come back, like what's he gonna do at that point, right? So I'm sure there's a big ego that he's dealing with.
And I think that ego gets quite deflated in his later years. So he actually ends up returning to Spain in the 1540s. And, we assume he's hoping to regain some favor, secure some of his titles and privileges. But again, to your point, Paul, the Spanish love legal disputes at this time. And he struggles to claim, any real recognition or rewards that he believed he was due to his conquest. He's somewhat successful. The monarch gives him a little bit of money, but he never really regains, the influence or status that he once held or he imagined he was going to hold on his return. And he spends, his final years again in relative obscurity, a lot of disappointment. He dies in 1547 in a city near Seville. His death's not really marked by any significant fanfare. He's buried without ceremony, which, is in stark contrast to the impact that he had on the world, really. It is a very strange, quiet end to someone who was able to reshape an entire part of the world.
I'm always shocked when you hear things like that because it just puts into perspective what historical figures really represent in today's day and age or throughout history. Columbus is another one. Right. We learned a lot about Columbus, and, he was definitely a celebrity when he came back for everything that he did. But at the same time, people looked at him a little bit like, this guy's a little nuts. I'm not sure I really want to work with this guy, and we're not going to give him any more money. But then years and years go by where people look at historical figures and say, hey, they actually did a lot of good because look at how rich Spain has become. And that all really started with Cortés. And without Cortés, who knows where we would have been. And from what we can see, Cortés, I don't think you can give him a good or a bad sort of stamp. I don't think you can blame him for everything that happened. I think there was probably going to be somebody else who's just as ruthless who was going to do the same thing. But at the same time, he's on another level when it comes to, I think, just selfishness and personal ambition and kind of disregard for those around him. And I don't know if he necessarily needs to be that. Like, again, he could have still accomplished a lot of these great things without that. And then on top of it, I think he's very, very lucky. I think he's the one historical figure that we've looked at where a lot of things go right for him. And obviously, I know it's one of those things. It's like, well, if things didn't go well for him, we probably wouldn't be talking about him.
Sure. Yeah.
But it's like on another level compared to a lot of the historical figures, like having Malinche and Aguilar having a three-way language triangle going on, and being able to escape Tenochtitlan with his life when most of his people are dying. And then he's able to come back in, and he's not arrested when Velasquez tries to pull him back, and he's able just to escape before Velasquez is able to hone him in. All these little things just kind of work out for him. And, eventually it kind of, the luck runs out. And I guess that kind of makes sense why the end of his life is the way it is. But I think there's a little bit more there than just, ambition and drive. There's definitely some luck and a lot of brutality.
Yeah, I think his life is fascinating. And I think he's quite a complicated figure historically, and giving him like a good bad rating is definitely not, an easy thing to do. Yeah. Like in some way in my head, it's one of those things where there's two truths that are obvious, but uncomfortable to kind of articulate. One is that I think it would be tough not to argue that he is a very strategically minded leader. He's adaptable. He's a tactician. He's shrewd. He knows how to get things done, right? But he's ruthless. He is absolutely ruthless, and he is willing to kill, and he has very little regard for the suffering of not just indigenous people, but it seems like anyone really at the height of his kind of impact that he's making. And I think related to that, you can see this kind of like boom bust thing that's happening with his life, this expansive nature in which he's able to gather power and prestige, but then, like all things, it kind of devolves. And I think that kind of just speaks to the nature of like political power and influence. Like eventually it's going to go away.
Yeah.
And I think he's kind of a reminder to me of the complexities and issues of analyzing these historical figures, because it takes a lot of mental gymnastics and analysis to walk away with any kind of meaningful, takeaways.
Yeah. And as you were talking there, I was just thinking of like, what would Machiavelli think of Cortés, right? We talked about Machiavelli maybe about 5-6 episodes ago, and he talked about being ruthless and being bloody and taking lives when you need to. And he talked about how you can do it, but you have to be very, very strategic on when you do it. And I don't see that with Cortés. I think it's violence for violence sake. It's the easiest way out for him because he is so much more powerful, where Machiavelli kind of says, hey, you can, if you need to burn a town to the ground, do it, but really think about why you're doing it. And if it's, and sometimes it, again, from a very Machiavellian view, it's the right decision.
Yeah.
But for Cortés, it doesn't seem like there was ever a decision to look at, Montezuma and say, okay, well, how can we figure something out here? So this is a long-standing partnership where we can slowly move our way into the city and take over politically and have more control, versus, hey, let's steal everything that's not nailed down and get the heck out of here. It's like a robber coming in and just saying, all right, let's steal everything and try to get out. Like I was saying to you offline, like it's like they were criminals without a getaway plan. They just kind of ran in and said, let's just steal all the gold and hope for the best, which I guess is 100%. Kind of the story of the conquistadors.
More or less. Yeah.
But I think the last thing is we can't take away from the fact that New Spain becomes a massive, massive player on the world stage. And if we look at Mexico today, everybody speaks Spanish and they're very, very Catholic. So that influence over years continues to happen. So I think we can definitely say Cortés is the first to kind of set the seed of Catholicism and the Spanish language, and it propagates throughout, the next few hundred years. But the way it kind of happens, I think is, it's not great, but the impact is there a bigger impact on the world today than what Cortés has? There's very few people, I think, that are at that level is what I think I'm trying to get at.
100%. I think the impact he made is probably one of the largest impacts to how it shaped the world we live in today. And I think it's also an example of how messy and complicated history can be.
Yeah. There's never a black and white answer. And I think this one, rubber stamped that one and made it even more clear.
Yep.
So anyways, this was, I think, been a great 2 episodes on, an area of history where I really didn't know much about. And I think when we talked about this, I said, let's do the Aztecs. They sound interesting, and boy, were they ever. So I think, it is a sad, sad ending, but, I think I got definitely a deeper respect for the Aztecs. And, I think it's definitely an area we're going to come back to and maybe look at some of these other folks that are involved in this story at some point.
Yeah, 100%.
Awesome. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll be back with another one in a couple weeks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.